I see. So this is live streamed.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Here we go.
Yeah. Looks like we are live. We'll give it a few more minutes just for the sound check. But
Where do you stream to? Are you streaming to
I am streaming to YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch.
Twitch? That
Uh,
was the one I was thinking of. Wow. Okay, cool.
yeah, I use a program called Restream.io, which lets you stream to 5 different places for free, and then like 30 if you pay them.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, it's really nice. It's convenient for someone like me because I only have like 5 that I care about. So
Right. Yeah, of course. That makes sense.
So, Stephanie, it looks like we're live. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. I am currently wrapping up a PhD in religion and science, which is its own field, in the religion faculty at the University of Oxford. And I study the ways in which people could be said to have religious relationships with science. So I do a lot of work on what science is, on what religion is. And that's all deeply motivated by my obsession with science that I've had, since a young kid. I have a constellation tattoo, Einstein shirts, like all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, I care deeply about these sort of things. Oh, I also have a podcast. I never promote my own stuff. I have a podcast. It's called Naked Humanity. It's, conversations about human nature. And I don't know if that's how you found me, but that's how most people find me these days.
Yeah, I actually did. I was watching your interviews. I usually try to find people who do interviews kind of like me, and then I subscribe to them, and then I steal all the people they interview, so I don't have to do any work.
That's great. And please steal the people I've interviewed because I do a lot of what I look for is academics who have great ideas and can talk about them in a way that like people can understand. And I know that that might sound weird, but it's true because each academic discourse has its own kind of language. And so trying to figure out how to translate them is actually a lot harder than it sounds. So please do take my people, take all of them. They're great.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things I was interested in talking with you about was you did some videos on academic publishing, which is just terrible because all of the academics have to specialize in their own little language in their own field and just work on publishing for that demographic, and then just forget about the common people who never get to see them, and all the papers and things are behind a gigantic paywall, and you have to use crack sites like I do to try and get to them without having to pay for them.
Yeah, I mean it's a really really big problem. Like I'm a huge believer in education and access to resources and all this sort of thing. And the academy just keeps getting like more and more wrapped up in itself and getting drifting further and further apart. And I think that that plays a really big role in this whole like disdain for intellectualism and stuff, like this sort of class conflict that is brewing, and like really really bad. I think it's part of the reason that so many people distrust science.
Oh yeah, for sure. And that's another big part of it is that you mentioned that there is a darker side of science. Science has ramifications that we need to be aware of. Could you tell us a little bit about what those are?
Yeah, so I love science. It just needs to be stated at the outset. My first degree was in the sciences. I studied the biochemical origins of life at Dartmouth. And so I have always deeply loved what it can teach us about the observable world. But something that science does is make claims about the observable world. Now, prior to like 1500, pretty much like there were no ways to really disagree about the observable world other than by saying, well, I read this text and I read that text, right? And so the natural way for humans to make sense of things is to have stories and to have myths and to sort of relate to the world in like a human way, right? Like all of our religions for the most part have other kinds of agents like us. The gods are similar to us but different, the spirits are similar to us but different. And that's kind of natural, I think, because humans are social beings. And so we're constantly seeing social stuff in the world and explaining the world in these ways and having these like deeply embedded traditional ways of thinking about things that just comes very naturally to us as humans. And so science, it grows out of religion, grows out of Christianity, right? Like it was very much a part of exploring God's creation, right? Just like getting to know the world that you lived in. But there came a point at which some of the claims that scientists were making were distinct, were contestable, to the claims of religious myths. And I see science as being something that is constantly, it's always revising its theories, right? It's always coming up with new observations. And so it's constantly tweaking its vision of the world. And the rest of the ways in which we make sense of things have to sort of run to keep up. And so there are people across religious traditions who are working very hard, decided either early on or jumped on the train later to be like, okay, we're just going to like keep a pace with science and adjust the way that we enact our faith accordingly. But there have also been people who reacted to that in a negative way for a wide variety of reasons. And politics, of course, is always wrapped up in it. But this like destructive side of science, I don't think is inherently a bad thing. But for example, the way that science sort of taught us that we were apes, taught us that we were evolutionary creatures. Okay, very cool. We can deal with that. But that's kind of a huge blow to this idea that we were like created in God's image. And so if you don't help people, if you don't break this news to them gently, if you don't work on talking about these ideas together and saying, okay, how can we move forward like with these ideas, then you're going to end up alienating a lot of people, which is sort of how we have ended up in the United States with such an entrenched divide between fundamentalism and science. Because in the 19th century, after Darwin was like, hey, by the way, we're apes, and again, because of the Civil War and politics and all of these different things, but in part because of the acceleration of science and these like revelations, people in the South turned away and said, no, we're returning to the fundamentals of the Bible. And it has now become increasingly entrenched over the course of the last 100 years.
That's a really interesting observation because if we take the idea that we have to break things to people gently or try to work it into society in a kind of softer way, wouldn't that be sort of what we're doing with the academic publishing right now, where we have the very niche publishing that can only the academics understand and no one can listen to, and then we have the academic educators and communicators who kind of break it to people gently and try to work it into society in a more understandable way? Isn't that kind of what we have now? But because I kind of think I like the other way of just releasing ideas into the public, just bare face value and kind of let things fall where they may.
Yeah, I think class has been an issue in this all along, right? And intellectualism was always incredibly hard to access, right? And so it makes sense that people who don't have access to these materials are going to be increasingly suspicious and feel looked down on. Like that is such a prominent theme in the political conflicts in so many nations today, is this like feeling of being looked down upon by the intellectual elites. So I absolutely agree with you that this information needs to be more available, right? Like today's moment is just another iteration of these moments that have been occurring throughout history. Um, so yeah, there are a lot of parallels, but I also think we would have to be, when I say things like break it to a culture gently, like what exactly does that mean? I think one thing that's a really important part of all this is the way we educate people. We focus a lot on educating people about facts, but what if we educate people on like critical thinking, understanding your emotional reaction to things? A lot of more, I think, basic ways of relating to the world and to ourselves, I think would be really helpful for sort of providing a basis out of which people could like engage scientific articles with like actually understand what's being said.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Our education system is total garbage because it's all just this is the answer and there is no other answer. So if you say there's an answer, you get it wrong and then you fail the test and you're a bum and you can't do anything in life. So you must get the right answer and this is the right answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think we need to focus a lot more on skills. And it has been moving that way, but also like education has so much inertia because so many millions, like everybody's involved in it. So it just changes so slowly.
Yeah, and I mean the goal of education isn't to educate, it's to get you to a point where you're a good worker and you do good for the economy and they don't really care about your level of intelligence at all.
Right.
So what is your position on the darker side of science? You said you didn't think it was necessarily a bad thing.
I mean, well, I mean, what's a good thing and what's a bad thing. I know that that's such like a philosophical cop out, but it's true. I mean, uh, science is definitely unequivocally a great thing, um, but as with all phenomena, they just impact different people in different ways, and so we have to be careful about it. So yes, I think it's wonderful that science has changed how we think about the world. um, I will say, if you want me to like lean into darkness so we can like maybe fight about it or whatever you want, um, I do think that a lot of, because science has so much power in terms of what we observe and how we theorize and what we think about the world, I do think that, and it's been so recent in human history, like really quite recent, that we haven't developed the tools to know what to do with it. And I think we are throwing some babies out with the bathwater, right? Because people who really like science, and I was like this for 10 years, I loved Richard Dawkins. I like, carried his books around in my purse starting in high school. Like, I was such a huge fan of science. And because I loved science, I thought, okay, that means I have to hate religion, right? But I think religion and science both can be practiced in really beautiful and really ugly ways. And so I really dislike the way in which both sides have become incredibly polarized. It's easy to see when you're in the secular world how much fundamentalist groups have like become entrenched and polarized, but it's also very, very easy to simplify them, to simplify religion as a whole, to ignore its complexity, when you're on like the quote unquote side of science. And so that, I think, is actually a really ugly piece of this relationship between religion and science today.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I don't think that the fighting or the in group out group kind of mentality is a good thing. I do appreciate the sharing of ideas, and but I do think there is conflict between them, because when there are truth claims made about religion that science says no, that's not true, in a pretty hard fashion. Like for example, we are evolved from apes, and as far as we can tell, there was no global flood at any point, not enough water, and so those kinds of claims do seem to come into conflict, and people who interpret religion to be literal in that sense have really hard time with that because of how important it is to their lives. And so I think that conflict is important, because I think that we should always try to search for truth. And when there are contradictory ideas, we should try to figure out which one is the truth. And but I'm not sure why that would necessarily be a bad thing. I think it's a bad thing that people aren't willing to engage with that without being confrontational.
Hmm. Well, so there is this idea, I think, in Western culture afloat, and this is something scholars talk about a lot, that we tend to define religion today, like very specifically today, we define religion in the American Western context as being allegiance to a specific set of beliefs. My religion means I believe X, Y, and Z. My religion means I believe all of these different things. And so it's very easy to see religion and science as two bodies that are making conflicting truth claims. And science is making a truth claim that is reasonable and wants to be falsified and self-corrective, and therefore it's like fantastic. And religion is asking you to like believe something quote unquote without reason, almost against reason, to take something on faith. And it's really easy to see that because those images are like very present in popular culture. um, but so far as like religion goes, it can mean a lot of different things. It can mean having a symbolic interpretation of religious stories. It can mean community that rallies around meaningful life events. It can mean participating in a quest for meaning, but not necessarily having a specific set of beliefs. It can mean the rituals you enact throughout your day. So religion can look like a lot of different things, and it doesn't, like I said, like they can both be done well or badly. And so I just, yes, I think it's a problem that people don't seek to correct their beliefs with empirical data, and we should have conversations with them about that and why and how we can like soften that. But I also never want to ever say science and religion with a capital S and a capital R are in conflict over the claims they make, because religion, I mean, when you study religion long enough, you kind of don't even know what it is anymore, because it's like it dissolves in your hands every time you try to like define it. It just falls into pieces because it's such a loose constructed category. And so I just want to be careful. I don't see a conflict between those two things.
Oh yeah, I would totally agree. In the broader sense of religion, I don't think there's any conflict with science because science doesn't say you shouldn't have any particular practices or you shouldn't prefer certain belief systems or treat people a certain way based off of beliefs. It's only about the truth claims. If you don't conflict with the truth claims, then science just doesn't care at all what you do. So would you say that in I think that the reason we see religion as that more narrow category of just this is my belief system of Christianity or whatever is because of that conflict and that divide between the truth claims is that we disagree with what the Christian Bible says, and that causes the Christians to turn away from science, and the scientists to turn away from Christianity, which causes that divide to appear, which makes the idea of religion very easy to define as those very simple categories. And I think that's why we usually tend to define religion in that sense, instead of the broader sense. Because I agree, in the broader sense, there isn't really a conflict at all. It's just you can do whatever you want as long as you don't conflict with the truth claims.
Yeah, and that simplification has sort of been, I think, intensifying over the course of the last few hundred years. And it's actually very interesting. Like the change to thinking of religion in terms of a set of truth claims actually started like in the 16th and 17th centuries, because in 1517 Martin Luther famously put his 95 theses on the Wittenberg Castle church door and was like, hey, I think religion should be practiced differently. And because he had the power of the printing press behind him, word spread too fast for the Catholic Church to be able to stamp it out, which is what they would normally do. They would normally just burn everybody, or assimilate them. They would either kill them or assimilate them.
Mhm.
That's what the church did. But with the printing press, these ideas spread too rapidly, and the church couldn't put it out. And then the Protestant Reformation started, and all of a sudden, there are people who like are practicing religion in different ways. And religion used to be actually thought about in terms of like this more public, shared way of valuing stuff. And all of a sudden, it became like an identity, and people started fighting. And philosophers at the time, like John Locke, were like, look, if we're going to survive, like in the wars of religion, like tens of millions of people died, right?
Yep.
And John Locke was like, if we're going to survive, we have to turn religion into something that we like keep in our hearts, we keep in our homes, we keep in our minds, and we don't like talk about it in public. And so then the whole like entire European continent be turned religion into like this is this is like my private belief, whereas it just used to be like, well, it didn't used to be anything, because the concept of religion didn't really have to exist until science came along. And all of these people started like fighting about, well, what they thought. So the conflict is very, very old, and this turn towards belief is very, very old, and it's very easy because it's a simple way to signify which group you belong to. But the thing that I'm constantly saying to my followers is focus less on identifying with like the content of your belief, but more with the way that you hold your belief, with that, which I think should be with openness and falsifiability and all that sort of stuff. Because I think that that's truly our way out of all this mess, is that we stop focusing on what we and other people believe, and focus on instead like our discourse and our conversations, and how to like, find better truth together, God forbid.
Yeah. You mentioned that this interpretation of religion started in like the 15th century, whereas because I'm curious what you mean by that, because from my perspective, this started much earlier. Since I'm of this religion, you're of that religion, we're going to kill you or convert you, and that ideology has been around for thousands of years at the very least. And I would see that as kind of more of the starting point of this kind of idea of religion as a truth claim.
Yeah, so I spend a lot of time thinking and writing about this. Um, so previously, people would, if you go way, way back, right, to when like everybody was in tribes walking around being like, sup, you encountered people with other gods, and you probably didn't hate them because they had other gods. You were afraid of them because they might kill you. And most groups were animistic, polytheistic, whatever you want to call it. And so it was very conceivable for like you to have your gods and them to have their gods. And that's just like how it was. And we see this in the Old Testament as well. We have our God, we're the chosen people, you have whatever, you know. Um, And then even in like say Greek and Roman city states, when there were like again there was a plurality of gods, but religion was like practiced publicly and it was tied up with politics. And so in that sense, even though you could like fight, right, and they like literally like they crucified people, they crucified Jesus because he's like I am God, and they're like well no you're not, but you're bad for us politically so we're going to kill you anyway, right? That's what they did. um like that was definitely a thing, but this concept of religion per se hadn't solidified and wouldn't for a very long time. Because then everything just sort of like collapsed back into this single thing. Moving into the Middle Ages, then there was like Christianity and variants, right? There was Islam and Judaism. And so most people knew that Muslims and Jews existed, right? But they were all like heretical interpretations of something that should have been true. And so the concept of religion, really, like religion as a system of meaning that can look a ton of different ways, didn't really take off until colonial expansion. Like it was this Protestant flowering and then colonial expansion. And people are all of a sudden they're counting, tribes in Southern Africa and cultures in the Indus River Valley. And they're realizing that like people look at the world like in radically different ways. And so it's sort of like an ongoing story. And also, of course, science was developing at the same time. So there were all of these big changes. And of course, there was always conflict on what people believed. But in terms of it being like this set idea of a private belief that you like enact in your own home, like that's, the birth of secularism, right? Like that really didn't happen until all of these like fomentive changes started bursting forth out of the, 15th, 16th century.
Would you
So to
con-
summarize, you're correct, but I'm just complexifying.
yeah. So, because I definitely think of like Constantine instantiating Christianity as the state religion during the late Roman era and in the Crusades, especially in the Middle Ages. I see a lot of moving towards that prior.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Like the Crusades were like, they are heretics and we're going to kill them, right? Like there's no denying that. But at that point in time, religion was still like this very shared, very publicly enacted. Nobody had to sit in the room and wonder, like, should I be Christian or Jewish? I mean, some people did, but like the vast majority of people just like assented to this very publicly shared belief. And that's what people have done throughout all of history is just like believed what the people around them believed. And it really wasn't until this, again, this flowering of religious diversity within Christianity that people did start like sitting at home being like, crap, am I believing the right thing? And I think that that has led to a degree of conflict and uncertainty that has been really destabilizing and maybe plays a part in the ways in which people become really like divided and entrenched in their beliefs.
Yeah, and I've watched a recent video, or I think it was recent, that you talked about reason and that reason shouldn't be held up as like the ultimate authority for everything. And I think this is like a interesting point. What do you mean by that specifically?
That is not where I expected you to go, but I'm very happy to jump into
Well, yeah,
my views on it.
I was thinking that the people who are have time to sit around and think about was my idea right or my idea wrong. What is the methodology they should be using? Reason is what the first thing
Oh
I would go
yeah,
to.
yeah. Well, I mean, my basic obviously we want to try to be as reasonable as possible. Period. To reiterate, I love science. I love rationality. I love logic. Like I am an empiricist and I like data a lot. But we need to understand that you literally cannot separate your thoughts from your feelings, period. David Hume, the famous philosopher from the 1700s, was quite famous because he had this idea about induction. He basically said, when you see the sun set and you know that it's going to set again tomorrow, you can't actually prove that. And so a lot of people see this as posing a problem about predictions, right? The fact that you can't actually prove that something that's happened before is going to happen again. But looking at Hume's writings and doing some reflections 400 years later, I think it's pretty easy to see that we are certain of things. Like when you think about the concept of certainty, certainty is a feeling, right? And it's like when you, the feeling of, I am certain I love that person is not different from, I am certain that 2 + 2 = 4, right? Certainty and knowledge, and they are both feelings. And you can have an anxious thought and then you have an anxious feeling, or you can have an anxious thought and then, or an anxious feeling and then it triggers an anxious thought. Like our thoughts and feelings are deeply intertwined. So when somebody wants to be reasonable and they're sitting alone in their room, and I'm laying in my bed at night, like staring at the ceiling, wide eyed, being like, oh my God, I exist. Like, you want to be reasonable, but the way in which you're going to be reasonable is going to be embedded in the, the culture that you grew up in, the ideas that you were exposed to, what you have been told has been reasonable your entire life. And so, yes, we want to be reasonable, but we need to understand that, like, objectivity in that sense is something that we should strive for, but never actually claim to have. Like, you can't get outside of your own context, period. And that's why I'm always saying, like, we should have an aspirational relationship with truth. Like, we should be striving for it and we should be enacting reason as best we can, but we'll always be flawed when we do it.
I definitely agree for the most part, but do you think there are certain kinds of objective claims that we can make, like 1 + 1 = 2 or A=A? I think therefore I am.
I spent my entire childhood hearing my father say to me, A=A, after having made like incredibly subjective claims. um, so it's just very interesting to me because, like, I don't know if it's, words are really, really hard and they have connotations that are very wide ranging or nuanced. Um, I definitely think claims like A is A and 1 = 1 like fall in the category of logic, and they go in that special closet that's like ta-da, really, like they're logic, and we need to, I really think that we need to hold up logic and everything that logic has taught us as like a fantastic epistemological tool. But in terms of our ability to use them in ways that like are logically solid, uh, that I have less confidence in, right? So like math, sure, fine, but do we always do math well? No, you know. Are we always correct when we draw mathematical conclusions? No. Um, I don't know. I might have just wormed my way out of answering that question.
Oh, I totally agree with you on all of that. But so, for example, do you think we can use rationality and logic in order to make progress? For example, because I think science does consistently make progress. I agree it's always tentative, and we don't ever have absolute certainty, or we've never discovered the final answer. It's always going to be tentative. But I do think we can say we've made consistent progress, like from Newtonian mechanics to general relativity to quantum mechanics. It's not that Newtonian mechanics was wrong, it was just less accurate than general relativity, which was less accurate than quantum mechanics. And as we make progress, we just get more and more accurate to like different decimal points, essentially.
When you say progress, do you mean like in terms of truth claims?
I would say so. So I would say I'm a fallibilist. So in philosophy, I take the position that we don't need absolute certainty to have knowledge. And so I think that if we do look at things like the motion of the planets or whatever, which can be described by Newtonian mechanics, we describe those to a certain level of accuracy. And then general relativity went to a far greater level of accuracy, because I think that with our ability to make predictions and say, I'm going to predict this is the way the world is, and I'm going to design a machine that can test that, have two separate variables, and that they both fall at the same time. It's a good evidence. It seems like we can get closer to truth claims, even though we can't know for certain that they are truth claims.
Sure. As to whether these theories correspond to reality, that's a very interesting question. Like, yes, I can observe this and I can use this equation to predict it, right? But I can't use this prediction to tell me like what the fundamental, or this equation to tell me what the fundamental nature of matter is. And I think you're right that we're becoming progressively closer to, an increasingly accurate depiction of reality. But I also, in terms of science, I am skeptical of the idea that we will ever arrive at a final, satisfying, complete answer. I don't, there's a theoretical physicist named Marcelo Gleiser who is advocating this idea that as the volume of knowledge we have grows, he calls it the island of knowledge, as it grows, so does the surface area against which it touches the unknown. And so he is an advocate for the idea that we're not actually eating the unknown, but actually just expanding into it. I know that that doesn't necessarily conflict with what you said, but I think it's a really interesting way to sort of um, an idea to juxtapose to this idea of like increasing accuracy, because like, does increasing accuracy mean that you're going to be fully accurate at some point? I'm not sure. And so are these like statements knowledge? Yeah, more or less. But do they reveal like the deep down things? No, and I'm not sure if they ever will.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I think that was Wittgenstein's problem of omniscience. Like if you know everything, how do you know everything without knowing something outside of yourself? So there's no way to actually have absolute knowledge as far as we can tell. There could always be some way we discover in the future that we just can't imagine or something. But yeah, as far as we know, there is no such thing as absolute knowledge. You can't ever claim to have objective truth about metaphysics. We can only just say this is what we believe with some level of probability, and that's about it.
Yeah, I'm definitely like a pragmatist in this, both in the philosophical and in the, more colloquial senses, right? Like, yeah, knowledge is, sure, let's call it knowledge. Fundamentally, we are humans and we have an extremely limited ability to detect things. And our science is probably extremely limited in terms of what can be known about the universe. Like we're just these flawed animals, like bumping around, being like, aha, electrons, which is great. But I like working knowledge for sure. I just, yeah, I wouldn't take it to that ultimate sense of like, ta-da. But we have to be able to say something, right? Like that's our problem right now is everybody's like, how do we say anything when we know Wittgenstein's problem, when we know that this saying this sentence is false should make your brain explode, right? Like, we have stumbled into this period in which we're so terrified of saying what's true or what isn't true because it seems like nothing is true. But we have to act as if some things are true, right? We have to act as if our observations cohere with reality, and so let's do it. I'm very happy to be somebody who says, okay, let's like do it.
And do you think that most scientists would disagree with that, or that they do want to make those kinds of absolute claims, or would you think they lean towards more though everything's kind of tentative? This is just what we know now. We're gonna probably prove this wrong in the future, but we'll accept this for the moment, for the time being.
Yeah, I think most scientists, like on a day-to-day level, like scientists, of which there are so many in the world, would probably say like, yeah, I'm just working on this little problem. But I do think from what I've read, right? So I don't know this literature very well, but there's a lot of work on like what scientists think about religion or what scientists think about truth and stuff like that. Um, it seems to be that they all sort of that generally speaking, they'll accept that it's it's quite limited. Uh, but outside of the scientific community, I think is where it's much more common to find people who have a sort of dogmatic loyalty or have blind spots to the limitations of what science can tell us. Now, again, I'm speaking very generally, but I do think scientists tend to understand that part of their craft, although some will like be in this community that's, very dog-headed about its truth claims. But generally speaking, outside of actual practicing science is where it's easy to be like, oh, like it's so true. Scientists in their day-to-day work know that they're making shit up. They know that like their theories are flawed. They know that they're working with a lot of blind spots. Like they know that. And there's a lot of really, really fascinating sociological work on those limits. And that's why it takes so long for science to move forward. Um, so yeah.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I think there are definitely limitations to science. But do you think that people outside of science who do want to place that absolute authority in science are in some way justified? Because it does seem to be the most reliable method that we do have for certain.
Absolute authority is a phrase that implies a lot of absolute authority. Should science be our authority on our observable world? Yes. Does science negate claims about what can't be observed? No. And that's for better or for worse, however it makes anybody feel. That's a fact. And so ultimate authority, uh, kind of, but that's so much authority and implies that you're not going to want to be open to the limitations of what science can tell us, and how that kind of allegiance to science can, I think, lead to real problems, because as science solves problems, it also creates problems, right? Science solves a problem of refrigeration, and then science creates a huge hole in the ozone layer, right? Like, as we are solving problems, we are also often creating them, right? We're inventing cars, and then we pollute, and then all of this sort of stuff. I definitely think that we have solved more than we have, created in terms of problems. And science should continue to be the way that we navigate the world. But I think, we need to walk forward understanding that, like, we need to think deeply about the implications of what we're doing with science. And B, we do need to make space for philosophy and other ways of thinking about, big questions that science can't touch.
Well, for example, mentioning the ozone layer, to solve that problem, wouldn't we also use science to solve the problems that it creates? Or is there another methodology? Because I mean, philosophy is kind of a part of science. I can't think you can't really separate the two.
I mean, I think most philosophers would, in theologians, like pretty much most people I know in the humanities would say that science falls under them, right? Because science is an observable method, but to know what to do with science, like to even make claims about what science is, you have to be using philosophy, right? You can't use science to teach you what science is. Science is ultimately just like people tinkering with instruments and making observations about the world. And so anything we do, thinking about morality, thinking about categories, right, thinking about how we want to define things, all of that is philosophy, and how we want to use things, philosophy. So I would fold science underneath that, which, sort of helps, I think, creates like a nice dialectical relationship. Science provides information, which we can use to like think about our morality, and then our morality can, in respect, do the science thing. In terms of the ozone problem, like, yes, absolutely, you would use science to troubleshoot that. But in doing that, you might also, you might create the production of chemicals that affects a community disproportionately because it's in low income housing that is close to a plant or whatever. Like, and then you can address that as well. It's just, we're humans, and we're not omniscient, and so we don't always anticipate what our technologies are. We almost never anticipate like all of the implications of what our technologies will do. And I think that that's something that, philosophy can be really helpful for, because again, like, science is literally just observing and predicting the world, and everything else is outside of it.
Well, yeah, I would definitely agree. I would say that philosophy is a much broader field, and then I would say science is philosophy plus this specific methodology, and so it's a smaller subset of philosophy. But I think that the important thing of science, what I think science is fundamentally, is just the ways we have to differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real. That's how I define science essentially. And for me, that's what's most important when we're trying to solve problems in the world, is we have to be able to differentiate between imaginary and real to be able to determine what are the real solutions going to be. And of course, we can't predict at all what the consequences are going to be until after we already know what we're doing in the first place. So that would be, it's always risky in science to make a discovery and implement it in the world, because that in itself is a new experiment to see what's going to happen. But it seems like I don't know of another methodology, like even in philosophy, that would be as useful in trying to solve problems in the world. I don't think that it's.
Of course not. Of course not. Right, but you also said something I find very interesting, and uh, is linked to the introductory sentence that you first said to me when we first connected, which was like, well, I don't know what the statement is. Like, I believe that science proves atheism, something, something like that. Please forgive me for oversimplifying what you said, but what's real and imaginary, right? But I think what it actually is science shows us what is tangibly real, right? In that sense, like, what are we seeing and touching and observing, like tangible reality. Um, Imaginary is an interesting word. I would say science shows us what's real, and then everything else is what's plausibly real, right? What could be real. And some people think experience or revelation or logic, right? Or just any kind of thinking about the world um, can also show you what's real. I do think science, again, takes epistemic priority in terms of telling us like what's real. But in terms of what's plausibly real beyond science, I just wouldn't use the phrase imaginary because, like, maybe, maybe it's all like made up and whatever, but also maybe we have just like put ourselves on the science train and, sped away from all of these different ways of knowing and are completely ignoring what is plausibly real beyond what we can like see and touch. And I don't mean that in a mystic, like I don't have a set of crystals somewhere, like I don't mean it in that way, but I do mean there is possibility for so much more. And it's incredibly unique at this point in time for us to ignore that so heartily just because science provides us information about what we can like tangibly touch, as opposed to what we can like theorize about.
Oh yeah, let me ask you about that. So from my perspective, like all information comes through us in the perspective of our minds, like our imagination. So everything is necessarily going to be imaginary. Like if I'm thinking of this cup, it's imaginary first, and then we have to say, well, is it also something else? Is it also a part of the world outside of my imagination, as far as we can tell? And so from my perspective, what science does is it takes those imaginary things and then puts them through a filter. Can we verify these are more than imaginary? And that's when I say, well, can it differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real? It's just showing us that additional step that we can show this isn't just imaginary. The other things may or may not be true outside of our imagination, but we can't verify it in the way that we can verify what scientists say about other things like cups. And that seems to be the difference.
And what is it about science? The fact that other people observe it that
Um,
makes it real?
well, I'd say future testable predictions. We can say, I have an imagination about what the world is like. And if that imagination is describing something about the world and not just in my imagination, then I can use that to predict something about the world because my mind can't control the world. And if that actually happens, then that's pretty reasonable to believe that what I'm imagining is describing the world and not just purely something I made up.
Yeah, I that's probably the only standard for which I would let that, that good answer basically. Yeah, future predictions are really potent now. Religious people, of course, all over the world will tell you, and not people, even people who don't identify as religious, right? But like you have an experience, somebody else has an experience. You're like, oh my God, we share that experience. It must be true, right? And so the fact that people can observe things all over the world, um, in the same way, of course, would like confirm that something is real. But no, I think by and large, tests of like religion, whatever that means, religious, quote unquote, religious truth claims, um, have demonstrated that they can't really predict the future or influence events. But of course, if you're theorizing about things that are beyond what is tangibly real, beyond what is futurely predictable, um, then all bets are kind of off. And I know that it's very easy from a scientific perspective to say, well, that's just like wish-washy hogwash and I'm not into it. But I also, there is an ultimate nature to the cosmos. There is. We don't know what it is, but there is an ultimate nature. And so, if we can't know it with science, then we're gonna have to think about it another way. And I know a lot of people would just say, well, then we shouldn't think about it at all. But I think I think it's really valuable to think about for a number of different reasons. But that's why I don't, even if you want to call something imaginary because it can't be proved in the future, uh, you know, logic, by that sense, what is that? What is math? What is logic? Can those things be proved in the future? And philosophy and all these different kinds of claims. I just think that it's worth opening space for those kinds of questions. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Oh yeah, I absolutely agree. I think we should never stop thinking about something. That would be dumb. We should always question everything. That's the motto. I forget. I think that was Richard Dawkins who said that. Question everything.
Sure, but you identify as an atheist, correct?
Yes.
What does that mean to you?
I believe that there are no gods. There are no reason to believe in gods. I think certain gods are logically contradictory, so can't exist. And so I think that the best evidence we have right now is that there is no God.
Right. Okay. So I haven't watched any of your other interviews. I would assume that you have talked with people or you've done research.
Hmm.
Smart, right? That like atheism is a negation of theism, right? And theism is a very specific idea about what a god or ultimate reality might be like, right?
Hmm.
It's like a guy in the sky that has a personal relationship with you. It's like Morgan Freeman or Whoopi Goldberg in a white suit, right? Like it's and atheism mostly says like, all right, I'm not into that. But there are so many ways of thinking about the world, right? In some sort of like creative event or as the ultimate nature of things is love, or there's a universal soul, or there's a universal non-soul that has this degree of peacefulness or sacredness to it. Like there's a lot of different ways of thinking about the world in an ultimate or metaphysical sense that isn't like God or not God. And so that's why like the rejection of theorizing, like people so often reject wholesale theorizing about like metaphysical ultimate reality because they don't like this like Christian idea of a God that they've encountered in Western culture. But that again, to me, that feels like throwing out the baby with the bathwater because there's so much richness and potential in these viewpoints, but they're beyond or more complex than these like oversimplified images we encounter in our world.
Oh, I totally agree. I love talking about the different metaphysical theories because there's the pantheism, panentheism, panendeism, theism, deism, polytheism, transtheism, henotheism,
You
omnism.
made this list before. It sounds like you listed these all before.
Yeah, it's one of my things is that the reason I would say I'm an atheist is because when we do think about these ideas about what is the fundamental nature of reality, I don't think we have a way to differentiate is this the real one and this the imaginary one or the other way around. That's why I like science because in science we have a way to differentiate which of the alternatives is the imaginary one and which are the real ones. And until we have a way to do that, I don't think we have a way to answer these questions. We could definitely hypothesize, but I don't think we have a way to actually indicate which one is the real one and which ones are the imaginary ones because there's all these different possibilities. And it's definitely fun to think about and try and boil it down to like simplicity, which one is the most plausible. And I like naturalistic pantheism is my preferred favorite one. But I don't think we have a way to actually differentiate which one's real and which one's imaginary. And that's why I'm an atheist, because I think that the most common theist claim is that we do. We can tell this is the real one, which is Christianity normally, and the other ones are the imaginary ones. And I'm saying, I don't think we can do that. I think we can't rule those out. And I think that we should withhold judgment until evidence is presented, as Neil deGrasse Tyson puts it.
Doesn't that make you agnostic, technically?
In some senses, because there are certain gods who I think are logically contradictory, and so I say no, those can't exist. So,
Interesting. Yeah, I definitely, I mean, people can do all kinds of linguistic and philosophical and theological gymnastics to jump around logical contradictions. And so, like, if they're going to do that, I'm like, fine. Like, with your starting premises, you can have that belief, but you have to understand that you're like, there is fundamental incoherence. And some people will like, and respond to that and say, well, the ultimate nature of the universe has paradox in it. And so ergo, like logical contradictions can exist. And I'm like, okay, fine, fine.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so no, I definitely, a lot of what I do actually is very in line with what you're talking about. I tell people, I actually just finished writing a book called The Existential Crisis Handbook. And I talk about a lot of different concepts of God. And I really like the process God. I like panentheistic gods. Like I really like these ideas and I talk about them all and pros and cons and some like, I'm like, here are some logical inconsistencies and here are some like problems with personal theism, but also like here are ways some people have tried to like solve problems with personal theism and here are ways that people like relate to like the Hindu ideas and all these sorts of things. Because I think that so long as people hold science up as the arbiter of what we know here in the tangible world, then like go, spread your wings, fly, like do your metaphysical hypothesizing. Because while I, along with you, have a lot of epistemic humility, and I'm like, I'm not going to make truth claims unless I like have data. I also understand that like we're all in different contexts, and most people like to listen to their feelings, and um, intuition and experience. Like, I'm not, just because I haven't had a religious experience doesn't mean that they're not real. Right? Doesn't mean that they're not true, and doesn't mean that they can't be listened to. And I know so many people who say those things. I'm like, well, okay, Um, so I want, I feel like people should feel free to do that. And I do really feel like if there's an ultimate explanation for things, which I think there is, um, I would rather lean into it and say, okay, so what does that mean for morality? What does that mean for how I should live my life? I would rather lean into it and theorize about it, because I think it can be deeply edifying for like my humility and my compassion and my ability to face death with courage and bravery and all of these sorts of things. Like, I do think that it can, if I think deeply about these things, it can like help me live a better life. I haven't personally chosen a metaphysical view, but like I do really enjoy getting to know what other people think, because it does, I think, help me be a better person.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. One of my favorite theologians who I had a conversation with was Pete Enns. He agrees that most of all the theological arguments are really bad, but you can believe based off of just personal experience, intuition, because you want to. It's something that's meaningful in your life, and those are purely perfectly legitimate reasons to believe. And I totally agree with him. So
Mm.
I'm totally down with that. Like, if you want to believe, that's totally fine. But if you claim that you have evidence, I'm gonna be like, okay, no, we're gonna fight. But other than that,
Yeah, but okay, so like, do you know what that sentence was that you said to me about atheism and science proving atheism or something like that? Do you know?
I have like a scripted
Like, what's your
email.
tagline? Yeah, or
Uh,
something.
I'm not sure. I think it was. I can actually look it up. I have the email. So, but
Well, I'm just curious about the way that you present yourself, right? Because I think it's in the way that we all present ourselves, ping-ponging around in these conversations. Because like aligning myself with science, I'm aligning myself with atheism. Great, but that like I think it's so easy in our oversimplified landscape to say like, to mean that that's antithetical to religion or against spirituality or all of these different things. It's just I'm very curious about how, and like, what's your audience like? Like, does your audience like metaphysical play? I'm just curious.
I imagine so. They come back. So, but yeah. So my intro was, I'm an atheist YouTuber. Would you be willing to have a conversation with me about should we believe in God or should we be atheists? Something like that.
Oh, why did I think there was science in the tagline? I thought you had a
I
science
think
related.
I think that was like the second one, because actually, after I
Oh,
started watching your videos, that's when I was like, you were talking about one of the things I was hoping to talk with you about was when you mentioned the destructive side of science, because that was in one of your earlier videos you mentioned that, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Let's talk about that.
yeah. Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, science is great. Just to bring it back full circle. Yeah, and I feel like I'm just constantly shouting into the abyss, like, can we please have some like discourse? Like, can we listen and have some discourse, complexity, and sensibility? Of course, it's a pretty big ask.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
yeah, you mentioned like mostly. I think the reason I present myself as an atheist is kind of evolutionary because it gets people's attention. When I send an email to a professor and I want them to debate me, I don't just send them something bland that they're just going to be like and just dismiss it. I want to send them something controversial that'll get them engaged. Like, you're wrong, attack. And so it seems like the presenting yourself in that kind of controversial way is actually a survival metric in the YouTube community to try and get people engaged.
Yes, it is, but I read a sentence like that and I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to have to fight with somebody about atheism. Because the way that you get attention is by debating, right?
Yep.
Like, people like to listen to fights, and I like to show up and be like, tell me what you think. Yes, but have you thought about this? And, for better or for worse, I don't know, like, my podcast audience likes that. But I'm absolutely 100% sure that I would have 10 times as many followers if I came out like really angry, you know, because that's so compelling to people. If you identify yourself with like a particular viewpoint, people either love you because they identify with it or they hate you because they don't. And then they want to engage it because they want to either love you or hate you or love to hate you, right?
Yep.
So, but that's like, I think that that's our fundamental problem, right? Is that we're so easy to like draw our ideological barriers and say, I'm over here and you're over there, and let's like fight about it. Um, And I honestly am kind of at a loss for how to soften that other than by like, again, by educating people to like question their in-group, out-group loyalties.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. That fundamental part of human nature, the in-group out-group bias, and trying to draw those party lines, especially like what we even started with, the party lines between science and religion, is such a fundamental part of humanity. It's a huge problem that we have to address. From my perspective, I think the best way to address it is to have conversations like this. Some of them you can have the fights with, and so you can keep people engaged, and then you have the nice conversations on the side, and they realize, oh, there's some that aren't so bad. Okay,
I mean, like just like sneak me in,
yeah,
like no, I mean, yeah, I think that's really great, and one way to do it. It's just so hard. Thank you for paying attention, whoever's listening. Uh, yeah, all in a day's work.
yeah. Well, we've been going for about an hour. It's been great having you on. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks again for being willing to come on here.
Of course, thank you. My apologies if I wasn't contentious enough. Um,
Oh, don't worry, we have enough flat earthers on here for that.
okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you so much. This is wonderful. I like what you're doing.
Thanks. All right, I will let you go. I'm gonna get some breakfast. I'll talk to you later.
Okay, thank you, Tom.
Bye.